Islamic fundamentalist terrorism is not a threat only in the Middle East, it's a threat to us here in Europe. It's a threat to North America. But I think we have to roll back the clock to look at the genesis of this threat. Who is the godfather of Islamic fundamentalism? Well, it was the 1979 revolution in Iran. It was when Ruhollah Khomeini came to power with a constitution that calls for the export of the revolution and the creation of a caliphate. Funnily enough, the same caliphate that Daesh seek to establish. So, you know, it's interesting when we look at the situation now in the Middle East, where we've heard from the previous panel and everyone in this panel, Iran is behind every conflict in the Middle East. They have sponsored and trained and led the brutal Shia militias in Iraq. They're backing Hezbollah, the Houthi rebels in Yemen, and they're the ones responsible with Putin for keeping the bloody civil war going in Syria with Bashar al-Assad, a murderous dictator at the helm, for 6 years now, nearly 7 years. Hundreds of thousands of innocent people killed. And the fingerprints of the mullahs are across the whole Middle East. Now, we used to look to Iraq as the bulwark against Iranian aggressive expansion. But in fact, very cleverly, I think, as the ambassador said, because they are a very smart regime, the Iranians have gradually infiltrated and taken on a huge influence in Iraq. They ensured that Nouri al-Maliki became the prime minister when in fact he never won the first election. They ensured he became their puppet. They constantly were pressurizing him from Tehran, get rid of all the Sunnis in your cabinet. And first of all, he accused his vice president, Tariq al-Hashemi, the most senior elected Sunni in the country, of terrorist offenses, arrested 12 of his bodyguards, and Amnesty International said one of them, when his body was returned to his parents, they couldn't recognize him because of the torture he had suffered. And based on the confessions under torture, accused Hashemi of terrorist offenses. He fled. Now he's in Turkey. And he's been sentenced to death in absentia 5 times. I think he's in the Guinness Book of Records. And then he tried to arrest his finance minister, also a Sunni. And he started imposing his oppression on the Sunni communities in Al-Anbar province and around the whole of Iraq, and created a civil war which resulted in sucking in Daesh from Syria, who last year, 2 years ago, seized 1/3 of the territory of the whole of Iraq. And then out of the blue, we have the Iranian regime with Qasem Soleimani that we've been hearing about, the head terrorist in the world. We have the Iranian regime saying, we will come to the rescue. We will become your ally in getting rid of Daesh, who are a threat to all of us here in the Middle East. And they have exploited the Daesh crisis to introduce their own genocidal campaign against the Sunnis in Iraq, wiping out hundreds of thousands of Sunnis and reducing to rubble some of the ancient cities like Fallujah, Ramadi, Tikrit, and now Mosul. Hundreds of thousands of Sunni men are disappearing. Smoking rubble is left behind. And we in the West think that they are our allies, and the Americans, I have to say, have agreed to provide air support to help them in this process. They're going to achieve in Nineveh province, in Al-Anbar province, what they have sought to do all along is to wipe out the Sunni population so that they can ultimately take control of the whole of Iraq. And they're doing this in the name of being allies of the West. It's incredible we have fallen for this. You know, we had 8 years of appeasement policy from the White House. And in the European Parliament, we had the absolutely dreadful head of security, Baroness Ashton. And if Obama said, jump, Ashton used to say, how high? We've got to see a change to this policy, although there is no indication of it happening yet with Mogherini. But, you know, I have a theory. When the Soviet Union was at its height, communists around the world were split into dozens of different factions. You had the Trotskyists, the Leninists, the Marxists, the Maoists. They all hated each other. They all fought like cats in a sack. But they all looked to Moscow as the godfather of international communism. The same, I believe, is happening with fundamentalist Islam. You have Daesh, Taliban, Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, Hezbollah. They all have difficulties with each other, yet we categorize it in the West as a Sunni-Shia conflict. It is not. All of these different factions who also fight like cats in a sack, they look to Tehran as the godfather of international Islamic fundamentalism. And in the same way, when the Soviet Union collapsed, we saw communism fade away. There are a few pockets left, like North Korea, Cuba, perhaps Venezuela, but it has almost faded from the international picture. And if we achieve regime change in Iran, I believe the same fate will occur to fundamentalist Islam. I think it will slide off the international agenda. But we started with the ambassador saying, let's come with some positive suggestions from this conference. Well, I have a couple of positive suggestions for Mr. Trump. You know, he doesn't need to tear up the dreadful nuclear agreement. If he wants to indicate to the mullahs, to the so-called moderate Hassan Rouhani, who now has the pride of being the biggest per capita executor of any country in the world under his moderate regime, if he wants to send a clear signal to the Iranians, then the easiest way to do that is to invite Mrs. Rajabi to Washington. In one stroke, he will send the clearest possible message that we have changed policy entirely from our predecessor, Obama. And if he wants to impress all of us here in this room and everyone who wants to see an end to this horrific, oppressive regime in Iran, then start the process by listing the IRGC as an international terrorist organization. How is it possible that the Quds Force, which is a subsidiary of the IRGC, has been a listed terrorist organization for years, but the IRGC gets off the hook? It runs and controls 70% of the Iranian regime's economy. List them, put them on the international terrorist blacklist, and you undermine the Iranian economy to the extent that that regime would be teetering on the edge of a cliff, we could then give it a helpful push